College projects are supposed to be simple, right? You pick a topic, do the research, put everything together, and maybe learn something in the process. When my friend David and I signed up for a media class, we thought it would be a fun break from our usual coursework. The assignment was straightforward: create a short documentary. But being the ambitious students we were, we wanted to take on something bigger, something that would make our project stand out, and most importantly, something we actually found interesting. That's how we ended up in the middle of a supposedly cursed woodland not too far from our town. Our goal was to disprove the old legends that had scared people away from those trees for years. The forest was beautiful in its own way, with towering green canopies and a silence that felt peaceful yet oddly heavy, like it was waiting for something. The local stories dated back generations. Some said an indigenous tribe once considered the land sacred. You know, the usual setup for every so-called cursed place in America. But then came the eerie stories: ghosts, sinister rituals, and strange disappearances. I always figured these were just old folk tales that had been exaggerated over time. Most people avoided the area, and those who dared to enter often returned talking about bad vibes and strange happenings. I never bought into all that supernatural nonsense, and neither did David. We thought all the fear surrounding the place was nothing more than superstition, making it the perfect subject for our documentary. A chance to strip away the myths and show our class that this was just another stretch of trees. We spent the first few hours filming the scenery, capturing the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, the thick vegetation, and even some caves we stumbled upon. Objectively, it was a stunning forest. One particular cave grabbed our attention. It wasn't deep, but the way the light flickered off the rock walls gave it the eerie aesthetic we were aiming for in our film. As we set up inside, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The sun dipped behind the clouds, and it felt like the natural sounds around us had faded away. That's when David suddenly froze mid-shot, whispering in a nervous voice, asking if I heard something. I hadn't, but the fear on his face made me uneasy. We stood there, straining to listen, and then I caught it too. A distinct noise coming from outside. We'd heard the wind rustling all day, but this was different. It sounded like footsteps approaching the cave. They came closer, then faded, as if whoever or whatever it was had backed away just before reaching us. We exchanged uncertain glances. We had spent the entire day laughing off the ghost stories. But in that moment, I wasn't too proud to admit I felt a chill. My mind ran through possible explanations. Maybe it was just a hiker or an animal passing through. But the longer we stood there, the more I struggled to believe the logical answers. Trying to keep my voice steady, I suggested we wrap up since we had plenty of footage. David didn't argue. We packed up quickly, both trying to act casual, but it was obvious we were rattled. As we stepped out of the cave, the woods seemed darker than before. The feeling of unease only grew as we made our way back to the car. Then the sound came again, this time louder and much closer. We stopped, listening carefully as the rustling turned into clear, deliberate footsteps. We turned, and that's when I saw them. Two shadowy figures moving swiftly through the trees, their shapes blending into the dimming light. Without hesitation, we ran. I glanced back several times, but I couldn't make sense of what was chasing us. I refused to believe it was anything supernatural, but in that moment, I truly couldn't tell. My heart pounded as David and I sprinted through the forest, dodging roots and branches. Meanwhile, these figures seemed to glide effortlessly. The faster we ran, the closer they seemed to get. I risked another glance back and got my clearest look yet. They were human, but something was off. Their movements were unnatural, too smooth. They were dressed head to toe in black, blending almost seamlessly with the trees. David saw me slowing down as I looked back and shouted for me to hurry. We pushed ourselves harder, finally reaching the car. We practically threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut. David's hands trembled as he fumbled for his keys. When he finally got the engine started, relief flooded me until I looked at the dashboard. A warning light flashed, tire pressure low. David looked confused but didn't dwell on it. He threw the car into gear, but when we tried to move, the vehicle lurched awkwardly. Every single tire was flat. I stuck my head out the window and my stomach dropped. The tires looked like they'd been slashed. Before we could fully process what was happening, movement caught my eye. I looked up and saw them, not two, but three figures emerging from the tree line. My pulse pounded in my ears. They weren't ghosts or apparitions, but actual people, dressed in all black, their faces concealed by featureless masks, similar to ski masks but entirely black. The doors were locked, but that did little to ease the terror rising in my chest. As they moved closer, David desperately tried to call for help, but the signal was weak, and the call kept dropping. Finally, he got through. He shouted into the phone, giving our location before the call cut out. I could see the figures clearly now. One had a smaller build, and their hands, decorated with glittery nail polish, stood out oddly in the dim light. The strange detail somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. I almost wished we were dealing with ghosts rather than real people. Suddenly, they began pounding on the windows and kicking the doors. Their fists slammed against the car, rattling it with every hit. My mind raced for a plan, but the fear was paralyzing. The smaller one, the one with the painted nails, struck the window harder, and I could see cracks beginning to form in the glass. Their laughter rang out, making the whole scene feel even more nightmarish. Just when it seemed like the glass would shatter, headlights cut through the darkness. A moment later, the wail of sirens filled the air. The masked figures froze, their laughter dying instantly. As a vehicle approached, I recognized it, a park ranger's truck. Without hesitation, the three figures bolted back into the woods, disappearing just as quickly as they had appeared. The ranger pulled up beside us, his face a mix of concern and confusion. He asked if we were okay, and we nodded, still too shaken to form words. He led us to his truck, his radio crackling as he called for backup. We left our car behind, relief washing over us as we got away from those cursed woods. Back at the station, we gave our statements. Police arrived and combed the area. Eventually, they caught one of the masked figures, a large man with a goatee and twin rose tattoos on his temples. The vines curled down his cheeks and neck. Perhaps the most chilling part? When the officers questioned him about why he did it, he simply smiled and said, "Because I could, and I wanted to." There was no remorse, no emotion, just satisfaction. The other two were never found. To this day, we don't know if they were part of some group or just a couple of deranged individuals. Honestly, I don't think I want to know. The thought of them still lurking in those woods, waiting for their next victims, is enough to keep me awake at night. David and I set out to prove the woods weren't haunted. We succeeded, but that doesn't mean monsters don't live there. It was the final week before I had to return to university, and my friends Emily and Sarah thought we needed one last adventure before summer officially ended. We planned a short hike through the woods and an overnight camping trip, nothing too strenuous. No pun intended for those who got my strenuous joke. Anyway, we just wanted to do something memorable before heading back to our routines of work and endless TV marathons. The day started off exactly as we had hoped. We packed up Sarah's car with all our gear, grabbed some snacks, and hit the road with music blasting and the windows rolled down. I think we played Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus at least 7 times. The trail we picked was about an hour away, a secluded spot Sarah's older cousin had recommended. "Hardly anyone goes there," he had told us. "It's beautiful, and you'll have it all to yourselves." That sounded perfect. On the way, we decided it wouldn't be a real camping trip without some drinks, so we stopped at a gas station to try our luck. None of us were 21 yet, but Sarah, ever the confident one, strolled inside to give it a shot while Emily and I stayed in the car, laughing and chatting. A few minutes later, she returned empty-handed, shaking her head. "That guy wouldn't even consider it," she grumbled as she slid back into the driver's seat. I could tell she was a little embarrassed. Sarah wasn't used to rejection. Just as we were about to give up on the idea, a guy who had been filling up his car walked over to us. He looked ordinary enough, average height, a bit scruffy, maybe mid-20s. He wore a clean blue flannel, and the most noticeable thing about him was his friendly smile. but something about how quickly he approached us set off a tiny alarm in my head. "Hey!" He greeted us in a deep, almost cheerful voice, leaning down toward Emily's window. "Saw you had some trouble in there. Need help getting something?" His tone seemed casual, but his eyes lingered on each of us a little too long. Sarah, always bold, jumped at the opportunity. "Yeah, could you grab us some beer? We have cash." She handed him a 20, and he nodded with a grin. "Sure thing. What do you want?" Something about his overly friendly smile unsettled me, but Sarah kept chatting with him. I tried giving Emily a look to silently express my unease, but it was too late. The guy was already heading into the store. When he returned, he had a case of beer in one hand and change in the other. "Here you go," he said, handing everything over with that same smile. But then he hesitated, as if expecting something. "Thanks, man," Sarah said quickly, taking the beer and giving him a little wave. Emily started the car, and before he could say anything else, we pulled out of the parking lot. As we drove away, I glanced back. He was still standing there, just watching us. "That was weird," I muttered. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Relax, he was just being nice. And we got our drinks, didn't we?" The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, and soon we were out in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and birds chirping. The hike was as beautiful as Sarah's cousin had promised, sunlight filtering through the branches, a winding path that made us feel completely away from civilization. We laughed, took pictures, and enjoyed the peacefulness. But as the afternoon wore on, I started feeling off. Every so often, I swore I heard something, small things like twigs snapping or leaves rustling. Every time I turned around, nothing was there. I told myself it was just normal forest noises. But no matter how much I reassured myself, I couldn't shake the unease. By the time we set up camp, the sun was setting, and darkness was creeping in fast. We built a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and cracked open some of those hard-earned beers. Emily and Sarah were having a blast, and I forced myself to play along, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. As we sat around the fire, Emily was the first to mention the noises. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked in a hushed voice. "It sounds like, I don't know, footsteps." Sarah was quick to dismiss it. "Come on, it's probably just animals." But even she didn't sound totally convinced. We sat in silence, listening, but after a while, the sounds stopped. We tried to shake off the eerie vibe and eventually climbed into the tent, bundling into our sleeping bags. Sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside started up again. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, human. My heart pounded. I could tell by how still Emily and Sarah were that they heard it too. After what felt like hours of lying there, wide-eyed in the dark, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The fire had died down, and I wanted to make sure it was fully out. I whispered that I was stepping outside for a minute, and they nodded nervously. Unzipping the tent, I stepped out into the cool night. The woods were pitch black, except for the faint glow of the embers. I grabbed a water bottle, ready to douse them, when I heard it again. A rustling, then, clear as day, footsteps. Right behind me, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned. Standing just a few feet away, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. My stomach dropped as my eyes adjusted and I recognized him. The guy from the gas station. His face was barely visible, but I knew it was him. The blue flannel gave him away. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at me. Panic seized me. I wanted to scream, run, do anything, but I was frozen in fear. He didn't say a word. He just watched me. Finally, I found my voice. "Get away from me!" I yelled, my voice shaking. The sound seemed to startle him. He took a step back, then another. Then suddenly, he turned and sprinted into the darkness. I didn't wait. I bolted back to the tent, shaking my friends awake. "We have to go. Now." I barely managed to explain what I saw, but that was all it took. Within minutes, we had packed up, stuffing everything haphazardly into our bags, and took off down the trail. The hike back was terrifying. Our flashlights barely lit the way, and every little sound sent us into a panic. We moved as fast as we could until we finally reached the car. We didn't speak much on the drive home. We were too shaken. Looking back, we should have called the police immediately, but at the time, all we could think about was getting away. When we finally pulled into Emily's driveway, we just sat there, staring ahead. Then I grabbed my phone and called the cops. I told them about the guy from the gas station, gave them the time and details. Sarah was panicking, worried she'd get in trouble for the beer, but I didn't care. If that guy was dangerous, I wanted them to know. Years later, we never found out what he wanted or if it was really him out there. But I still remember that moment, the way he just stood there in the dark, staring. And I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't gone outside. Not the most comforting thought. Back in 2016, my wife and I, along with our friends Mike and Lisa, had been preparing for this hiking trip for weeks. We all worked at the same company, but since we had very different roles, it was rare for us to get a long weekend off together. So when the chance finally came, we jumped on it. The plan was to head out early on a Saturday morning and spend the whole day exploring the wilderness. We had mapped out a trail that was supposed to have breathtaking views, and we were all excited to disconnect from our busy lives for a while. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. We chatted, swapped stories, and enjoyed the early morning calm. But as soon as we pulled up to the trailhead, our excitement took a hit. The sky darkened almost instantly, and within minutes, the rain came pouring down. It was so heavy we could barely see in front of us. Hoping it was just a quick shower, we decided to wait it out in the car. We had driven all this way. Turning back so soon wasn't an option. The rain hammered against the roof while our breath fogged up the windows. It wasn't the start we'd envisioned, but we were determined to make the most of it. After about 20 minutes, the downpour eased into a misty, overcast day. We debated whether we should still go ahead with the hike, but the trail was calling us, and we didn't want to waste the opportunity. So we grabbed our gear and set off. We hadn't gotten far before the rain returned. This time, even harder. It felt like someone had turned on a faucet at full blast, drenching us in seconds. Laughing and swearing, we ran back to the car, shielding ourselves as best we could. But as we reached the vehicle, something made us stop in our tracks. Standing right next to our SUV was a young woman. She was soaked, her clothes clinging to her thin frame like rags. She looked like she had been through hell. Her tangled hair stuck to her face, which was smeared with what looked like dirt. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me because of the rain. But no, she was definitely real, standing right by our car. Even more unsettling, she appeared to be peering into the windows. Without thinking, I shouted something like, "Hey, back away from my car," more out of fear than anything else. It was pure instinct. Something about her presence just felt off. But she didn't react. She just stood there, staring at us with these hollow, empty eyes. It was the kind of look you see in an animal frozen in headlights. Before I could yell again, my wife grabbed my arm and whispered for me to wait. She pointed out that the woman looked hurt. Mike and Lisa were silent, unsure of what to do. I didn't want a stranger in our car, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the possibility that she was in serious trouble. Against my better judgment, we let her in. She sat behind the front passenger seat while my wife sat next to her, trying to comfort her. The car felt cramped. The windows fogged up again from the added body heat, and a thick tension filled the air. What had started as a fun hiking trip had now turned into a bizarre, unsettling encounter with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. The woman didn't speak, not a single word. She just sat there, shivering and staring straight ahead. My wife guessed she might be in shock. Her makeup was streaked down her face, though we couldn't tell if it was from the rain or from crying. We tried asking her where she was from, what had happened to her, but no response. I kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror, searching for any emotion, but there was nothing, just a blank, vacant look. Mike suggested we drive to the nearest gas station to call for help, and we all agreed. There was no phone service out here, so it was our only option. I started the car and carefully navigated the muddy road, the windshield wipers working overtime against the relentless rain. I know it's easy to say this in hindsight, but something didn't feel right. Sure, it was a stressful situation, but that wasn't what was bothering me. It was the way she had just appeared out of nowhere. The way she sat there, silent and unfazed by the cold or the storm. There was something deeply unsettling about her, and I could tell my wife and friends felt the same, especially Lisa. We were only about 2 minutes from the gas station when the woman suddenly let out a scream. And not just any scream. A loud, high-pitched, guttural wail that sent shivers down my spine. It startled me so badly that I nearly lost control of the car. She thrashed violently in the back seat, pounding on the windows and seats, making it nearly impossible for me to steer. I fought to keep the SUV on the road, but the rain had made it slick, and before I knew it, the tires lost traction. The vehicle skidded, veering off the road and into a ditch. For a moment, everything went still except for the sound of rain pounding against the car. We sat there, breathless, trying to process what had just happened. And then the woman started laughing. Not a nervous laugh or a relieved chuckle, but a cold, hollow cackle. I had hit my head on the steering wheel, leaving a small cut on my forehead, but everyone else seemed physically okay. Before we could react, Mike turned to her and shouted, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Her laughter abruptly stopped. Without a word, she reached into her soaked shirt and pulled out a small blade. It looked like a box cutter. In one swift motion, she pressed her left elbow against my wife's neck and held the knife close to Lisa's throat. "Give me all your money," she demanded. The most unsettling part? There wasn't an ounce of fear in her voice, only this sick, twisted satisfaction. None of us argued. We threw down whatever cash and valuables we had. We were too terrified to do anything else. My wife started crying. Mike was muttering curses under his breath. I was just trying to stay calm and not escalate things further. The woman grabbed the money, flung the car door open, and bolted into the storm without looking back. We sat in stunned silence, watching the open back door sway in the wind. After a few moments, I started the car again, my wife shut the door, and we drove the rest of the way to the gas station. We reported everything to the police, but by then, she was long gone. They took our statements, but it was clear they didn't expect to find her. To this day, I have no idea who she was or where she came from. I tried looking up similar crimes in the area for weeks after, but I never found anything that matched. All I know is we were lucky to make it out alive. Even though we weren't seriously hurt, the memory still makes my stomach turn. Somewhere out there, that woman is probably still out in the world, ready to do the same thing to someone else. A few summers back, I spent my vacation working as a lifeguard at a retreat tucked away in the hills. It wasn't exactly a big tourist attraction, but it had a steady flow of visitors. Mostly folks looking for an escape from city life, a chance to explore some trails, and enjoy the calm of the wilderness. The retreat was spread out with a main lodge, a handful of cabins scattered across the property, and a pool that was more of a lounging spot than an actual swimming area. One quiet afternoon, the kind where the sun beats down, and the most exciting thing to do is sip a cold drink while half dozing, I was on duty at the pool, keeping an eye on things. It was the usual crowd, married couples and young adults celebrating different occasions. One particular group stood out, a bunch of women enjoying a bachelorette weekend. As I kept watch, I noticed a guy hanging around by the fence that separated the pool from the rest of the retreat. He was dressed for swimming, but instead of heading into the pool, he was just standing there, staring at the women. First, I didn't think much of it. People often stopped by to ask about pool hours or guest passes. But this guy wasn't asking anything. He just stood there watching, then started talking to them. It was clear they weren't interested, avoiding eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. After a few minutes, I decided to step in. I walked over casually and asked if he had a pool pass. He turned to me, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he'd argue, but he just shrugged. muttered something under his breath, and walked off. The women looked relieved. One of them, a brunette with the brightest smile, waved me over. She thanked me, saying he had been creeping them out. I tried to play it cool, saying it was just part of the job. It felt silly, like I was some kind of action hero, but they didn't seem to think so. Instead, they introduced themselves. Her name was Mia, and her friends were Natalie, Jess, Kate, and Olivia. They were celebrating Olivia's upcoming wedding. We talked for a bit, and they mentioned they were staying in one of the cabins for the weekend. As the conversation flowed, they invited me to a small get-together they were having that night. I didn't have much else going on, so I figured, why not? That evening, as the sun dipped and the temperature cooled, I made my way to their cabin. It had a cozy porch with a view of the woods. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, with drinks, snacks, and soft music playing in the background. It was just the 6 of us, though they had invited some other guys they met earlier that day, none of whom actually showed up. We talked, laughed, and after a few drinks, Olivia suggested a night hike. I wasn't too excited about the idea, not because I was scared, but because I knew what kind of animals roamed those woods after dark. Still, I didn't want to be the buzzkill, so I went along. With flashlights in hand, we stuck to a familiar trail that looped around the retreat. The usual nighttime sounds filled the air: crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves. But after a while, I noticed something else, something faint, like footsteps trailing us. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing but darkness. Mia seemed uneasy, and after a few minutes, she hesitantly asked if anyone else had heard something. We all stopped to listen, and there it was again, quick, erratic movements nearby. It wasn't just the wind or an animal. It sounded deliberate. Olivia and Natalie had enough and decided to head back, and none of us argued. The walk back was faster, and by the time we reached the cabin, the mood had shifted. The carefree energy from earlier had vanished, replaced by a tense unease. We locked the doors and tried to shake it off, but it wasn't easy. Just when we were settling in, Jess and Kate made the bold decision to go back outside. Several minutes later, we heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. The wood creaked under the weight. It didn't sound like Jess or Kate. Natalie, who had been the most shaken during the hike, suddenly froze. "Did you guys lock the back door?" she whispered. My heart dropped. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed to check. It was locked, but I had this gut feeling that someone was just out of sight, lurking beyond the window's reach. Before I could warn the others, a loud crash came from the front of the cabin. Jess and Kate burst inside, screaming that someone had chased them through the woods. I ran to the door, trying to calm them down, but as I turned to close it, I saw him. A man, sprinting straight at me, had pulled over his face. Before I could react, he slammed into me, knocking the air from my lungs. He was strong, stronger than I expected, and as I struggled beneath him, I saw him reaching for something at his waist. My mind screamed danger, but I couldn't break free. Just as panic fully set in, there was a loud crack. The weight on top of me shifted, and I looked up to see Mia standing over us, gripping a golf club, her face pale but determined. She had hit him hard on the side of the head, knocking him out cold. We called the police immediately, and surprisingly, they arrived fast despite the retreat's remote location. Turns out, the guy was a new maintenance worker who had started just days before. He had been using his job to scout the place, and whatever he had planned that night, I don't even want to imagine. We pressed charges, and he was arrested on the spot. Even now, it still shakes me how some people are just wired for harm. If Mia hadn't acted when she did, I might not be here to tell this story. Some of my most cherished childhood memories involve my mom taking me to Girl Scouts. It's funny how certain moments stand out more than others. I don't recall much about selling cookies, but I clearly remember my mom sewing the badges onto my uniform. I'm not sure if certain things are more vivid in my mind because I lost her, and this was one of the main activities we did together, or if it was just my love for learning as a kid. Either way, Girl Scouts remained a big part of my life into adulthood. I've continued volunteering, even though I don't have kids of my own to share these experiences with yet. The story I'm about to tell is one I've never written down before, so bear with me as I do my best to recount it. It happened during one of our annual camping trips, where we had food, activities, hikes, and plenty of ways to keep the girls engaged. I always helped with preparing meals and organizing arts and crafts. I would use my own money to buy snacks and approve treats while also looking up creative ideas for kids who weren't interested in the outdoor-focused activities. As a child, I often felt out of place and would have preferred arts and crafts to help ease me into things. This particular trip started like any other. Most of the leaders were mothers of the scouts, along with a few other volunteers like me. As usual, we kicked things off with a morning hike. The girls were always excited to explore, and it helped them get familiar with their surroundings. Plus, a good hike usually meant they'd be worn out by nightfall, leading to a peaceful sleep. At first, everything was normal. The trail was safe, and the kids were chatting excitedly. But then, out of nowhere, I felt an odd stillness. My ears suddenly felt blocked, like there was pressure inside them, and all I could hear was a faint buzzing. After a few seconds, the feeling passed, and I quickly looked around to check on the group. That's when I realized that one of the girls, Lily, was missing. I hurried to the line of scouts, scanning for Lily but not seeing her anywhere. Trying not to panic, I started calling her name and moving ahead to see if she had wandered forward with another group. I came across one of the other mothers and asked if she had seen her. She must have noticed the worry in my expression because, as soon as she said no, she turned back with me and started calling Lily's name too. Minutes passed, and we alerted the others to stop walking so we could do a head count. It had been about 5 minutes now, and real fear was beginning to set in. We were just about to call for help when we spotted Lily calmly walking just off the path in the woods. I rushed to her, asking if she was all right, but she seemed completely fine. She wasn't scared or disoriented at all. If anything, she looked content. I checked her over, no scrapes, no dirt, nothing unusual. Holding her hand, I led her back toward the group as the leaders reminded the girls to stay in a single file line and not wander away. Lily was normally a quiet and reserved child, but now she was humming and chatting away, which was very unlike her. I smiled and asked her why she was in such a great mood. She cheerfully replied, "I met a new friend in the woods. They told me to stay away from the man in the blue cave." I stopped for a moment, confused. "What do you mean? Who did you meet? Did anyone touch you or say anything strange?" She just kept smiling in this unsettling way, insisting that her new friend was nice and would never hurt her. But everything she said kept circling back to staying away from the man in the blue cave. Goosebumps ran down my arms, and my stomach twisted. I kept questioning her, making sure she hadn't really encountered someone dangerous, but her responses were vague. I started to wonder, had she actually seen something, or was her imagination running wild? The vast, mysterious woods could easily inspire a child's imagination. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned, thinking about the man in the blue cave. Was it just a child's fantasy, or was there something more to it? Thankfully, the rest of the trip went smoothly, and everyone made it home safe. Over time, the memory faded, and I rarely thought about it again, until years later, when we returned to the same forest for another camping retreat. At first, I didn't remember the strange incident, but one night, as I sat outside struggling to sleep, I noticed a little girl getting up. I asked if she was okay, if she needed to use the bathroom or wanted a drink of water. She shook her head and said she was just having trouble sleeping. I reassured her, telling her that sometimes it's hard to rest when we aren't in our own beds. But then she said something that made my heart drop. "That's not it," she whispered. "My friend keeps waking me up, telling me I need to go see the man in the blue cave." A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't hear anything at all. My mind raced. "Who's your friend?" I asked carefully. "Who's telling you this?" She couldn't quite explain. It wasn't clear whether someone in her tent was waking her up, or if it was all just a bad dream. But hearing about the man in the blue cave again years later, that couldn't be a coincidence. I guided her back to bed and told her to let me know if she woke up again. She never did, but I didn't sleep at all that night. not even for 5 minutes. The next morning, I packed up and went home. I've never returned to that place since. This event happened roughly 8 years ago. I'm changing the names for privacy, and this is a temporary account. This will be my only post under it. At the time, I had been with my girlfriend, let's call her Lisa, for 4 years. We both shared a love for nature. Whether it was hiking, fishing, having picnics, or just taking random drives to new parks to explore. One Saturday morning, we decided to go on a hike. Since it was quite a drive from home, I packed our camping gear in case we decided to spend the night either camping or sleeping in the car. However, if the weather turned bad, we figured we'd just endure the drive back instead. Neither of us wanted to sleep in the car during a storm. The hike began peacefully. The sounds of running water, birds, and rustling leaves created the perfect atmosphere. The very reason we loved being outdoors. It was our escape from daily stress, a way to clear our minds. Our hikes were often filled with deep conversations about our future, where we'd live, the type of house we'd buy, and even discussions about avoiding parenthood, so we could have the financial freedom to travel. Oddly enough, our best talks always seemed to happen while hiking. As we ventured deeper into the forest, I suddenly felt uneasy. It was like the entire atmosphere had shifted. The once calming nature sounds started to feel off, almost distorted. The rushing water we had passed earlier now sounded like faint whispers. I also had the unsettling feeling that we were being watched, as if something or someone wanted my attention. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overthinking, and continued our conversation. After a while, I felt unexpectedly tired and asked to take a break. I wasn't usually the one to get exhausted so easily, so I assumed I hadn't had enough water that day. During our break, I noticed a change in Lisa's behavior. She became unusually quiet and seemed irritated. I dismissed it, assuming she was just tired too. I tried shifting the conversation to a more cheerful topic, hoping to lift her mood. But soon, her irritation turned into outright hostility. Every comment I made was met with a snarky or rude response. At first, I thought she was joking, but it became clear she wasn't. I asked if she wanted to take a break, turn back, or just walk in silence. Anything to improve the situation. But she refused to answer. She completely shut down, giving me a blank, unreadable expression. I started replaying the day in my head, wondering if I had said or done something to upset her, but I couldn't think of anything. Just as we reached the deepest part of our hike, Lisa suddenly had a full-blown breakdown. She began screaming and crying at the same time. Confused and alarmed, I stepped toward her, asking what was wrong. But instead of responding, she became aggressive, flailing her arms wildly. One of her swings actually hit my temple, knocking my glasses off. Now, without my glasses, I was in trouble. I have terrible eyesight and couldn't see much of anything. While I scrambled to find them, Lisa continued screaming and suddenly took off running in the opposite direction. I panicked, feeling vulnerable without my vision. But luckily, I found my glasses quickly and ran after her. When I caught up, something was very off about her. Her eyes weren't exactly glazed over, but they looked different, like she was there but not really there. It's hard to explain. At this point, she had stopped yelling and flailing. I sat her down and made her drink some water. She still wasn't speaking much, but she seemed calmer. After making sure she could walk, we started heading back to the car. Strangely, the further we got from where she had her breakdown, the more normal she became. By the time we were about half a mile from the car, she seemed completely back to herself. She then asked me what had happened. She had no memory of the entire episode. When I explained it to her, she was embarrassed and kept apologizing. I struggled to make sense of it. We had been together for 4 years, and I had never seen her act like that before. Not even during the most stressful moments of our relationship. Lisa strongly believed in the supernatural and was convinced that something dark had possessed her in those woods. I didn't believe that, though. I needed a logical explanation. After doing some research, I found out that the area had certain plants that could cause hallucinations, fever, and even manic behavior if someone came into contact with them. It made me wonder, Maybe she brushed against one of those plants and had some kind of reaction. And maybe I had a minor reaction too, which could explain my earlier uneasiness. Since I'll never know for sure, I decided to take the simplest approach. I just won't ever hike in that place again. Has anyone else ever experienced something like this? I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. My former boyfriend, who was still my partner at the time of this story, let's call him Jake, and I loved to travel whenever we could. Exploring new places, even for a short trip, was something we always looked forward to. That said, we were both pretty introverted and preferred doing our own thing. When we went camping or hiking, we liked to stay away from the crowds, avoiding busy campsites and trails where people were packed in close together. One time, Jake heard about a hiking trail from a coworker. It was supposed to be a pretty tough climb, so we thought it would be a good challenge and a perfect short getaway. We had a big tent and some extra gear to make things comfortable, so I was actually really excited about the trip. When we arrived, we picked a secluded flat spot to set up camp, sheltered from the wind. Then we set out on the long hike. At first, I was excited but also a little nervous. That excitement quickly turned into irritation when we ran into another couple hiking the same trail. It wasn't that I thought we had more right to be there than they did. It was just that I get anxious around new people and tend to be socially awkward. The couple introduced themselves, and we politely made small talk. They were surprisingly friendly, and the way they spoke put us at ease. They asked if we wanted to hike together since it was a long trek. We figured that if we got tired of the company, we could always turn back, so we agreed. As we hiked, the couple proved to be knowledgeable about the area, and I actually found them easy to talk to, something unusual for me when meeting strangers. After about 45 minutes, I started lagging behind a little. That's when the guy, whom I'll call Mark, slowed his pace to match mine and struck up a conversation. That's when things started feeling off. He began commenting on my physique, asking what kind of workouts I did. He mentioned that his partner was trying to tone up and stay fit. Then, he put his hand on my arm and gave it a squeeze, saying, "Wow, you must spend a lot of time working on those arms." I pulled away, startled. Just minutes ago, I thought he was nice, but suddenly, I felt his eyes all over me, and a bad feeling settled in my gut. I hurried to catch up with Jake and whispered what had happened. To my shock, he told me that the woman had also been making inappropriate comments to him. She had even made a suggestive remark about his lower body, making sure to clarify that she wasn't referring to his backpack. That was it for us. We decided to turn around and politely thank them for the conversation before heading back to our campsite. Luckily, they wanted to continue the hike, so we were able to leave without making things awkward. After eating dinner back at our camp, I realized something strange. My bracelet and ring were gone. I never take them off, and it didn't seem possible that they would just fall off without me noticing. I spent 15 minutes digging through my bags before stopping dead in my tracks. I turned to Jake and said, "Mark touched my arm and hand when he was making those weird compliments. Do you think he could have taken them without me realizing?" Neither of us was sure, but Jake said he'd go back up the trail in the morning to check if I had just dropped them. We decided to turn in early, knowing we'd have to wake up early to look and then head home. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sharp sound of a snapping branch, followed by what sounded like whispering. My heart pounded as I listened, straining to make out any words. I finally shook Jake awake, and he must have heard it too because he immediately put a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. He quietly unzipped the tent to take a look outside. Then, suddenly, he yelled, "Hey, what are you doing over there?" It was the couple from earlier. They claimed they had stumbled upon our campsite and wanted to warn us that they saw a bear nearby and were worried it might wander into our camp. Jake thanked them for the warning but firmly told them we were fine. He then zipped up the tent and sat silently for several minutes, staring at the tent's window. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Grab everything you can. Get in the car." I started to ask why, but he just repeated himself with urgency. We scrambled to grab as much as possible. He even half collapsed the tent and stuffed it into the truck without packing it properly. As soon as we had our essentials, we sped off. Once we were safely on the road, I pressed him for answers. That's when he told me that when he had looked outside, Mark had been holding a knife. Not just one, he had another one holstered at his side. Jake didn't feel safe staying another second, so he made the call to leave immediately. When we finally got home and tried to shake off the whole ordeal, curiosity got the best of me. I searched for the couple's names on Facebook. What I found made my stomach drop. The only results I could find were linked to a tragic incident from a few years prior. A couple with those same names had died while on a camping trip. And no, this isn't some ghost story. The picture of the deceased couple didn't match the two people we had met. So why were they using fake names? Was it just to steal from people, or did they have something far worse planned? I don't even want to think about what might have happened if we had stayed.